these networking meetings that we're going to be having and various things, casual. I mean, I want it to just be a casual atmosphere. We're also, you know, crazy during the day and the farmers markets and everything else. Well, that's why, you know, we're going to come in and learn. I don't know how stressful tonight's going to be about the labels, but we'll see. But Dr. Allen will add her, you know, smiley face to it all. So
I guarantee, however stressed you guys are about this, it will be nothing compared to talking to farmers about the produce safety rule. This is a breeze.
Well, we do have Jack who's going to be doing some recording because we do have a lot of rural folks that can't make it all the way into Salt Lake, and this is such good information. And going forward, we're going to try to do this on a regular basis, so we'll have it up. Now, here's the thing though, here's my fear, is if we start doing that, nobody's going to come. And we really want you guys to come because there's something about, I mean, Laura's been in this with me for a really long time on these meetings, and there's something about getting together and discussing and talking together. So when you can be here, it would be great if you could be here because I think it's important for us to all talk. Okay, with that being said, feel free to get up and get what you need, and then we'll turn the time over to Dr. Allen.
We'll wait for just a second. Let everybody.
Well, how many people know who Dr. Allen is, first of all? Thank you. I just assume that everybody's been in this world forever. Well, Dr. Allen works up at USU Extension, and she is the go-to
Food quality and entrepreneurship specialist is what I do. So I've worked with, believe it or not, over 600 Utah-based companies. Not all of them are around anymore, but in looking at the numbers, it is over 600 in the last 8 years. So there's a lot of people that I started with when they were tiny, who now are shipping regionally, internationally. So anytime anybody has a question, email me.
And she's really great about getting back, and we're working together on trying to, you know, help everyone get with their labels and just whatever they need. We go back and forth sometimes about various things. So if you reach out to Dr. Allen if you have questions. And then also, if you ask me something I can't answer, I usually email her. So.
Do you have an email address that you can share with us?
Yes, and I have cards, so I'll set those out. We'll pass those out. But let's go through this. I'm hoping my voice holds out. I apologize if it doesn't. If you can't hear me, you might want to move forward a little bit. Normally, I could project clear out to the hallway. Tonight, that's not going to happen. So I'm going to ask, if you can't hear me, please scoot forward a little. So let's go over the timeline for the nutrition facts. This is something that has been in the works for several years. So in 2014, they had the initial proposed rule. For about a year and a half before that time, there was a committee working on how the nutrition facts panel needed to be redesigned. The one that we're used to seeing has actually been around since the 80s. We've seen little tweaks, a minor change here and there, but overall the format, the basic requirements, those things had not changed for 30 years. So this was a huge undertaking that the FDA looked at what has changed in nutrition science, which of the major nutrients with those daily values need to be changed. Does it really grab the consumer's attention? And as part of this gathering of information for their proposed rule, that initial proposed rule, they actually worked with some universities to do a study where they had several different formats for the nutrition facts panel that gave the same basic information, they just looked a little different. And they had people set up viewing these on a computer, and it actually tracked where their eyes moved and how long it stayed on specific pieces of information. And then from that, they came up with this new proposed format that we'll see in a minute that supposedly is supposed to grab your attention more. You focus on specific components and get more from that panel, even though it contains basically the same information that the current version does. I think it is an incredibly interesting study how they did it, and I think it is going to make a difference for about 3 or 4 years until we all get used to seeing the new format again and we stop looking at it and we get really good at ignoring it, just like we did with the original version. So in 2015, based on comments that they received from the original proposed rule, they went back and revised some of the things that within that rule. Some of it had to do with, excuse me, with the way that certain nutrients could be analyzed or tested. Some of it had to do with format changes, things consumers liked, things industry didn't like. So there was some back and forth on certain parts. And then they published the final rule in 2016. This went into effect July 26th, but they have extended the compliance dates because there is still quite a bit that's up in the air. So in 2018, they moved those compliance dates back an additional 2 years. So we'll talk about when companies of different sizes have to comply, but essentially everyone has until 2020 or 2021 to have that new format in place. So an overview of the main changes. They've changed the nutrients, how they're listed. In some cases, which ones are listed. Some are leaving, some are appearing. The layout will change, but the FDA said it still follows the iconic layout of the nutrition facts panel, and that it is recognizable. And iconic was their word, not mine. The serving sizes have been updated to be more realistic, which I still, well, we'll get to that. I take issue with some serving sizes. I think why not be actually realistic based on what we eat, not what we should maybe eat. If we saw what we're actually eating and those numbers listed, maybe it would help people decrease portion sizes. But when they say, oh, well, this is how much you should be eating, and so you get a huge plate full, as we're all eating pizza from the pie, I know this is the perfect time to talk about it. With those portion sizes are tiny, and you see that nutrition information, there's a disconnect, and you have it in your head that that's representative of what you're eating. So I think maybe do it the other way around might help us a little more.
So are there updated rack tables? How are we supposed to
Yes.
figure out what the serving size is?
Yes, there are updated rack tables. And I have those, and we'll talk a little more about some of those changes in just a few minutes, too. So first, before we start talking about the regulation, I want to make sure that everyone is aware that the small business exemption has not changed. This is still in effect. So there are 2 ways that you might be exempt from nutrition facts labeling. So you still have to have the other components, but there is no federal requirement for your label to have the nutrition facts panel. A lot of small companies, even though they qualify for one of these exemptions, still have to put that panel on there because it's required by the stores that they're working with, where they're selling. So just because you qualify for this, if someone that you're working with to carry or sell your product wants that panel on there, you're still going to have to do it. If you don't have that issue, and you're thinking right now, well, maybe I should get nutrition facts, if you qualify for one of these exemptions, maybe you should just wait until those compliance dates start to roll around and everything that is still in flux has been finalized. So the first exemption is a retailer exemption. A lot of our small companies that do direct-to-consumer sales would actually qualify as a retailer as opposed to a manufacturer, where they could argue that their primary business function is selling product directly to the consumer. So in that case, if you are doing up to $500,000 a year in total sales, that includes food and anything else that you may sell, say at a farmer's market, if you have additional things that you're selling that complement your product, it's that total sales volume. You are exempt if you're under that $500,000 limit. When you're looking at just your food sales, it's up to $50,000. So the only time on this table you can see that you would be required to carry nutrition facts is if you're selling more than $50,000 in food annually and more than $500,000 total of all category products in sales. All right. Again, there are going to be a lot of people that, according to this chart, are exempt, that a retailer is going to say, no, you have to have that on your panel if we're going to carry your product. So the second exemption, if for some reason you don't fit into the retailer definition, is the manufacturer exemption. This is based on the number of employees and the number of units of each product, each distinct product that you make in a year. So for the employees, it's full-time equivalent employees. So that means if you have two people, that between the two of them, they work a 40-hour week, that is one full-time equivalent. That's not two employees, it's one FTE. Okay, so if you have under 10 FTEs and you do under 10,000 units or SKUs for that specific product, you're exempt. And you also don't even need to file a notice with the FDA to tell them that you're taking the exemption. If you are an importer, even though you meet that 10,000 units and 10 FTEs, if part of your product line includes imports, then you do need to notify the FDA and submit that exemption form. But you still are exempt from nutrition labeling, you just have to file annually. If you are doing under 100,000 units and you have under 100 full-time equivalents, employees, then you are still exempt. You just have to file with the FDA annually. If there's anyone who's interested in taking this exemption, you can email me. I'll send you right to the website where those forms are. It's all done online now. It's actually pretty easy to find on the FDA website. They went through a while where they were moving stuff around and you could not find anything to save your life. But I've noticed in the last several months, it's much easier to navigate. Things are finally being put back where they should be. So,
Karen, a
Yes.
question on this one. If we have some units that are over 10,000 but under 100,000, it's only the ones that are over that 10,000 limit that we have to register through that FDA site, right?
okay, so that's a good question. Did everyone hear that? So you have some products, if all of your products are under that 100,000, where you're exempt but you have to file, but some of your products are under 10,000. Do you have to file the exemption just for the ones that are over 100,000? And the answer is, the exemption is given to a company, not to a specific product. So you would provide a list of the products that you make that you are claiming that exemption for. And I would say if you have a few that are also under that 10,000 limit, because you're already required to file, I would recommend putting those on that form anyway. So as soon as those grow to the point that you're over 100,000, that's already in the FDA records. Yeah. If all of your products are under 100,000, the FDA really doesn't even want to have to bother with doing the paperwork to follow you. But if you have a few that are over that threshold, just provide information on the rest.
Do you have to register for the small business exemption with the FDA as well?
Well, this would be the small business exemption for nutrition facts.
Or, I'm sorry, the first one we were talking, the direct,
Okay.
the retailers.
So if you, based on your business model, and this is where we'd have to look individually at how your business is set up and what your primary function, how that's defined, whether it's as a manufacturer or through retail sales of your product, or exactly how your specific business is set up. You could qualify for the retailer exemption, in which case you do not have to file regardless. You could qualify for the manufacturer exemption, in which case you would have to file if you fell into one of those three categories. But that is something that I'm happy to kind of work through with you.
If you wholesale, but also retail, which one do you fall into?
Manufacturer.
Okay. For all
Yeah.
products?
It depends on what percentage you're doing wholesale. There are some strict definitions based on your product mix, but I would say if you are doing any wholesaling, and there's the potential for that to grow and push you out of what would qualify as a retailer, file for the manufacturer exemption where you submit that paperwork if you're over 100,000 units. So I'd say at that point, if you have that mix, keep this documentation. As soon as you're required to register for the exemption, just do it, because you're still exempt. It's just about what paperwork you keep, so.
So in that 10,000, so I have a product that I sell in 3 different sizes. Do those 3 sizes count as different ones?
No,
Okay.
no, because they have the same serving size, just a different number of servings per package. So it would be the product itself, not the size of packaging that you're offering it in. And if you have one that's vanilla and one that's chocolate, those are 2 different things, because the nutrition facts to calculate those would be different. So this is really just aimed at if you are doing such a low volume of sales that it is an inconvenience or an unreasonable cost to come up with those nutrition facts, that they're providing you with an exemption for that, a way to not have to do it.
So with
Okay.
respect to that, so it says units, and
Uh-huh.
just now you said serving size. Is that what units means? Is that
No,
serving
no.
size?
So units means how many packages, but the question was, if I have the same product in 3 different size packages, the serving size is the same. So you could sell 4,000 of one, and 4,000 of another, and 3,000 of another, but the nutrition facts would be determined the exact same way for all of those. It's just, you would have one that says, this has 10 servings per package, this has 5, and this has 3. Okay.
So on the exemption, when you have different sizes of packaging, they've actually rejected that from us before, because they said, well, this is the same product, just sold in another size. And so how do you choose which unit size?
All of those are the same product. So I, in that case, would report the number of, I would combine all different package sizes as that
Kind of
specific
biggest
product.
unit? So we sell things by the pound or by the ounce, as an example. Should we just by the pound, because then we fall
Just-
more into the
yeah.
exemption?
I would say if you are selling, okay, so let's look at the 100,000. If you're doing 50,000 based on ounces and 60,000 based on pounds, but it's the exact same product, just in different size packages, I would say you've hit that 100,000 units, because it's the same product in those packages. It's just you're putting a different amount in each. But the nutrition facts are the same. And the whole point of the exemptions is it reasonable to expect you to calculate nutrition facts for that product based on the low volume? And in that case, I would say, yes, it is reasonable. You're doing over 100,000 unit sales, even though it's a mix of different size packages. Okay.
This is yearly?
Yes, this is annual. Yeah. Okay, let's move on now to the nutrition facts. So the changes to the nutrient listings. There's required information on added sugars. I have some examples of mistakes not to make for this specific category, and know that there's still, for certain products, this is still somewhat up in the air. Which is why I recommend, especially if you're doing honey, hold off on changing over to the new nutrition facts panel format. There's a new definition for dietary fiber, which has changed in some cases the types of fibers that the FDA will allow to be used in calculating the total fiber in a serving size. There are some changes to daily values and to listings for some nutrients. There's a summary here. The last page of the handout is a table where it breaks it down, everything that is being changed. So I won't read through this part right now. So let's start with the added sugars. This refers to any sugar that is added to your product for the purpose of sweetening that product. That includes refined white sugar. It includes organic white sugar. It includes brown sugar, molasses, honey, agave syrup, maple syrup. What else can we come up with? Anything that you are putting in there to increase the sweetness is an added sugar. And there are a couple of different ways that you can handle that. You can list, and we'll look at some examples, you can list all of the added sugar, or all of the sugar as added sugar, or you can go through, depending on the product, some calculations to figure out what proportion is the added proportion. In some cases, it's very easy, pretty straightforward. In other cases, such as fruit juice, used to sweeten a muffin, those calculations can get very complex. Sugars that are fermented, so for example in bread making, or sugars that react during processing to form brown colors, can be excluded from the total sugar line. You just have to show how you're calculating that loss of sugars that were there but then chemically or biologically were removed during processing.
Is your computer going to help us figure this out?
Nope. Nope. And in fact, when people email me and say, can you test for the sugar after this browning process? It's like, nope. I don't have that capacity. There are some private labs that can do sugar testing. I don't know that it's necessarily worth it for most categories of products. If you're making bread and you're losing some sugar, both between the yeast fermentation and then also because there's a little bit of browning on the crust, I don't know that it's going to be so significant that it's worth it. If you're making caramel and there's a lot of browning, I don't know that people are going to be so worried about how many of the sugars are added if they're eating candy. So there's a realistic, approach you have to take to it as well. At what point is it not worth the money or the worry to try to get every single sugar possible out of that added sugar line?
Will it at least help us sort out the basic stuff?
Yes.
So if I'm adding sugar versus this potato has sugar in it, it'll help me figure that out?
No, but the FDA does have some calculations, and we'll go through and look at some examples of that situation.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so for single ingredient sweeteners, and this for any of our honey producers, this is the one that I'm recommending just hold off on that nutrition labeling for now, or use the old format. Don't switch over to the new format quite yet. You have to list all sugar as added sugar. That is true for maple syrup, for honey, for granulated sugar, for corn syrup. Anything that is a single ingredient sweetener, all of that sugar is listed as added sugar. What is the issue there, especially for someone that is bottling honey? If you were a consumer and you picked up one of those cute little honey bears and it said added sugar, what do you think is in that bottle? Not honey. So this is a huge issue. The FDA is considering a footnote that can be added to those specific products. So there will be added sugars, but then there will be a little asterisk or symbol and a footnote that says, none of, these sugars are the natural sugars present in honey, and it's a requirement that we list it this way. It's not because we put sugar in it. So they're debating what wording they're going to use. They have told us to expect guidance on this early 2019. There's been a lot of discussion on the pros and cons. The sugar industry saying the sugar in honey, the sugar in honey is the same as the sugar in granulated sugar. Why do they get away with not listing added sugars when we have to list added sugars? And then the honey and the maple syrup side is, but we're not physically putting additional sugar in there, and that sends the wrong message to the consumer. So we'll see how they end up working this out, but hopefully by the beginning of 2019, we'll have more information. So they actually established a daily value for added sugar. Now I want to point out that sugar, total sugar, does not have and never has had a daily value. If you look at a nutrition facts panel, there's no percentage listed for sugar. You will now have a percentage listed for added sugar, but not for total sugar. That has thrown the cranberry juice industry into a huge tizzy because they say, hey, the apple juice manufacturers can add sugar as needed to bring it to a standardized sugar content from harvest to harvest. Some years you have apples that aren't quite as sweet, so they can add sugar to bring it to an industry standard. And those sugars are not counted as added sugars because that is the natural variability of our agricultural crop. The cranberry producers say we have to add a little bit of sugar regardless to make it an acceptable product for consumers because it's just too tart. But it still has less total sugar than apple juice or orange juice. But the cranberry producers have to list all of that sugar as added sugar. So there's a lot of confusion. I think it's going to take a few years to really kind of get a handle on the fallout. So depending on what your product is, be aware that there are some of these issues and that there's the potential for consumers to be very confused by this information and what it actually means for your product. And just be prepared to answer those questions in the best, most honest way that you can to help your consumers understand what your product really is. Okay, so let's skip to dietary fiber. The FDA has a specific definition. So it is a component that is naturally present, it's intrinsic and intact in a whole fruit, vegetable, grain. That fiber that is in an intact plant gets to be counted as fiber regardless of its chemical structure. For things that are isolated or purified from a plant source, or things that are synthetic, that are created through chemistry, not from that food source, but are structurally similar, those are evaluated on a case-by-case basis. It used to be that basically all of those things that were non-digestible carbohydrates were allowed to be listed as fiber. That is no longer the case. So they came up with a list of 8. These 8 were the only purified fibers that they were going to allow to be used in calculating total fiber in a product. Anyone who does any gluten-free or low-fat or fiber-fortified type of product, what do you see missing? There are quite a few big ones that industry relied on that were missing from this list. So the FDA reviewed 26 components and asked for comments and studies from industry, from consumers, from academia, and as a result of that, they came out with this year a statement saying that they were going to use enforcement discretion when they looked at how people were calculating added fiber. The reason for that is because they came up with a list of 8 additional non-digestible carbohydrates. And on this list, we see some of those that were missing on the other one that are commonly used. Things like inulin, polydextrose. Those are really common fiber sources for a purified, refined fiber. Now, what the enforcement discretion means is that until this can go through the rulemaking process, which could drag on for several months up to a year, until this goes through the rulemaking process and is finalized, the FDA will not issue warnings or pursue any type of recourse against manufacturers who are also using things from this list of 8 fibers in their fiber calculation. So if your product has inulin or polydextrose, you can keep including that. This is why I'm saying don't switch to the new format quite yet. Because if you are using software to calculate the nutrient content of your food and not actually sending it out and paying thousands of dollars worth of testing, if you are using a database, that database may spit things out in the right format, but you have no guarantee that it is updated with all of this information that is still in flux as we move forward. I wouldn't be surprised if before we see that 2020 compliance date roll around, we see another 2 or 3 fibers added to this list. So you could be doing yourself a disservice by switching to the new format until all of this settles. Let the big guys deal with it. And once their dust starts to settle, then the smaller producers can step in and update panels. The other thing that's interesting is the caloric value for polydextrose has always been set at 2 calories per gram, along with the other fibers, the fibrous components. They've now come out and said polydextrose is only 1. So anyone doing low-fat types of products, this is a very positive development for them. So I'm not going to go through all of these because these are the charts that you have. But I wanted to point out a couple of things that are listed in these charts. For the main nutrient listings, I have the old requirements and the new requirements, even if nothing changed. That's just for those major nutrient listings. And this is the very last page of your handout, because to try to read these tables broken down on a PowerPoint slide is ridiculous. So they're just given as a single table. For the required vitamin and mineral listings, I went through and listed those out specifically. But then I also included some voluntary vitamin and mineral things. These are things you don't normally see on a nutrition facts panel, but it was always voluntary. Depending on the nature of your product, you may choose to include that information for that nutrient. And these are ones that fall in that voluntary category that there were changes for. So changes to format. There's going to be a larger font size. Some of the components also have to be listed in bold. The actual amount for those required nutrients has to be listed. So if you look at an old format nutrition facts panel, it will say vitamin C such and such %, but it doesn't give an actual weight. For those required nutrients, which now include vitamin D, calcium, iron, and potassium. So no longer vitamin C, that's not required, it's voluntary, you can still list it, but you don't have to. So that gives the new ones that are required. You're now also going to have to list a weight. That's either milligrams or micrograms, depending on the nutrient that you're talking about. There's a new footnote. The % daily value tells you how much a nutrient in a serving of food contributes to the daily diet. 2,000 calories a day is used for general nutrition advice. So looking at the format side by side, you can see the new footnote takes up much less space than the old footnote. And you may have panels where you only have this little portion on there because of the size of your label, but for someone with a larger label, like a cereal box, they were required to have this whole table included in their footnote. So now that's going to take up much less space, which means overall the nutrition facts panel can take up much less space because you can still get that 1/16 of an inch requirement for the small O and have this whole thing be a little smaller profile than this whole thing. So you can see it still looks pretty similar. Certain things are bolded, calories right up there front and center. One thing you'll notice, calories from fat is gone. You can't even voluntarily list that. How do you feel about that change? That's one that's been confusing to a lot of people. Why wouldn't they want to list the calories from fat?
Is that a result of the new research on dairy that shows that different types of fat actually have different effects on the body? So they're finding dairy fats react very different and in a positive way for your body, whereas other fats don't. So it's not very fair to a dairy product to have that listed there.
Yes, and it's not just specific to dairy. It's all of the research that's been done on things like olive oil, on different nut oils, where they're finding it's not even just saturated versus mono versus poly, but the specific types of fat within each category. But in general, if you have saturated fat, those are the ones that are more likely to potentially have some issues versus the unsaturated. So they felt that you can relay that information on the nutrition facts panel, but if you're eating something that has a very healthy fat profile, and here you see this big number saying calories from fat, that could scare consumers away from products that actually current research is showing are very healthy and are things that we should be consuming at a higher level than we have. So that was the reason for them getting rid of that, because they think it's potentially misleading. There's that added sugars line with a percentage. Notice no percentage for total sugars. If this situation comes up in your product, be prepared for questions. You're going to get them. Just be aware what those numbers actually mean and be prepared to answer that and talk to consumers.
If you have nothing but added sugar in your product, you still have to list total sugars?
Yes. Yes, so you have to repeat that number. Yep. Yeah. Okay, so changes to serving size. They actually have new categories now for appetizers. This is the result of looking at the FDA serving sizes versus the USDA serving sizes. So if you had something like pizza rolls that were intended to be an appetizer, the USDA had an appetizer serving that was much smaller than an entree serving for the pepperoni pizza rolls. The FDA had one serving size that was for entrees. So you would look at the serving size for pepperoni pizza rolls, and it was a fraction of the serving size for the cheese pizza rolls that were under FDA requirements. So the FDA has updated that to match the USDA defined categories, so we'll have much more consistency on those types of products. There's also now a new serving size for breath mints. As ridiculous as this sounds, think about the difference between a Lifesaver and a Tic Tac. So the previous serving size was by weight. One Lifesaver was roughly one serving. You had to have like 10 Tic Tacs to hit that same weight. Who eats 10 Tic Tacs unless they're under 8? So the changes to the breath mint category, as ridiculous as it sounds, now a serving for Tic Tacs is 2 pieces, so much more reasonable. So it's based on the manufacturer's recommendations for use rather than a strict weight limit. And seaweed sheets. It's the other one I thought was really interesting. This is brand new. We never had a serving for seaweed sheets. But now, everybody eats sushi all the time. You walk down the street and you buy it at the gas station if you're really adventurous. And people are starting to make it at home. And they're buying seaweed sheets. That's not something that we saw in large volume 20 years ago. So how do you label those seaweed sheets with nutritional information if you don't have a serving size? So just one other interesting category to show you they're trying to be responsive to consumer trends. The serving size will also, oh yes.
What does RACC stand for?
Oh, okay. Hold on. RACC stands for Reference Amount Customarily Consumed. And there are big, long tables in the Code of Federal Regulations that list serving sizes for a lot of different categories of food. These are the old ones. You can also print up the new ones. Most of these things have not really changed, but there are specific categories that are added, and then there are a couple of other things, like ice cream, where they changed the serving size. So one of the things is the serving size is no longer strictly tied to the weight that is given in these tables. You can have up to 200% of that weight and still consider that to be a single serving. So if the reference amount for your product is 30 grams and your package has 58 grams, that can be one serving. You don't have to try to list it as 2 servings. Larger packages, though, one of the new changes, if you are between 200 and 300% of that rack value, you have to do a dual declaration listing. That gives per serving and per package. So we've all picked up that bag of chips at the gas station. And it tells you there are 3.5 servings in there, or let's say 3 to make it fit with this. And you say, yeah, right. I'm going to eat this entire thing by the time I'm 3 miles down the road. In that situation, it would have to tell you per serving, and then right next to it, this is what you get if you do what 99% of Americans do and shove the whole bag down your throat as fast as you can. So they're being a little more realistic when they're looking at the actual packaging. They did have up to 400 for this, but that created a big issue for one specific industry. Any guesses? Oh, come on, you were just talking about dairy.
Ice cream.
The dairy industry. What's a serving of milk? 8 ounces. How many of you have ever bought a quart of milk? Every single time you buy a quart of milk, that would have 4 servings in it. You'd have to have dual declaration on that quart of milk, which is not how people are going to use it. Reasonably, somebody could pick up a pint and say, yes, I'm going to drink this whole thing. But most people aren't going to do that with a quart. It also created problems for sour cream. Sour cream packages would end up having to list some of those things as well. So it was in response to the dairy industry that they took a step back and said, okay, we will go with 300. So I mentioned one of the updated things is for ice cream. I just have to say, I still think they got this wrong. Everyone here knows 1 pint of ice cream is 1 serving. If they sell a pint of ice cream with a spoon taped to it, that means I'm supposed to eat the whole thing. Right? But they said, no, that's 4 servings, because the serving size used to be 1/2 cup. They've now decided that a serving size can be 2/3 of a cup. So that pint of ice cream now has 3 servings. But fortunately, because of that 200 to 300% requirement, the pint of ice cream now has to have a per serving and a per real serving line next to it. So we all know exactly what we're getting when we eat the whole pint. So this is what that format looks like. You can see they'll list the servings per container, the serving size information, but in addition to that per serving, it will list the whole container. So this is going to apply to candy bars, all kinds of things, unless they choose at 200%. So this one is for a 200% level. They could still choose to only list this 440 calorie column and say that that entire package was 1 serving. So at 200%, you can list it either as a large serving or in the dual declaration. So when will we see this on foods? I mentioned they had pushed the date back to January 1st of 2020. That is for companies doing more than 10 million in sales annually. I'm guessing there's no one in this room that that applies to. Okay, so for everyone else, you have until January 1st of 2021. Now technically, that's if you're doing less than 10 million a year. But if you qualify for one of those small business exemptions, that still applies. You don't have to have nutrition facts panels if you qualify for those small business exemptions that we talked about at the beginning. If you choose to have nutrition facts panels, or if a retailer says to you, you must have nutrition facts, you have until that 2021 date to switch over to the new format. So there is no rush. I get so many questions from people saying, do you have the new format? I have to have the new format. And I tell them, no, you don't. Take a deep breath, take a step back. If you're doing nutrition facts panels because you want to, maybe wait another year or two, and then start with the new format once the dust is settled. If you're doing it because you're required to for some reason, because you've made a health claim, so it's an FDA requirement, or you're selling through a grocery store that requires you have it, stick with the old format, and then once the dust has settled, we can convert you over to the new format. You can voluntarily switch sooner, but be careful about blending formats. I have had people send labels to me to review with panels using the new format. And what we're going to go over next is kind of a collection of issues that I have seen that would actually cause a problem. You can use 100% old format or 100% new format, but you can't combine elements of both. And be very careful, because a lot of templates online that give it to you in the new appearance, you won't necessarily be putting the right numbers in, because those daily values have changed in some cases. Oops. Oh, I think my pointer just died. Okay. No, it was actually my computer asking me if I wanted to update. Okay. So the examples I have here are for dairy, because I gave this to a group of dairy processors from across the country. I figure there's no point in redoing these examples to include non-dairy because the issues are still the same. So this example was feta cheese. Here's the old format, 320 mg of sodium, 13%. The daily value for sodium has dropped. So based on that chart that I gave you, sodium went from 2,400 milligrams to 2,300. Now for a lot of foods, the rounding, it's not going to matter. But here, if you were to do the math, that does not equal 13%. It's 14. So if you take the numbers from your old panel and put them into a template that gives you this appearance, your numbers might be wrong. You need to go through and double check everything. Another one for vanilla yogurt. Total carbohydrate, 13 grams. The carbohydrate value has changed in addition. So in this case, what's listed as 4% would really be 5 based on the new defined daily value. So if you use this format, you still say 13 grams and 4%. If you use this format, you have to use the updated daily values. And that is where a lot of people are not completely switching over. Here's an added sugar example to show you a couple of different ways that you could present this. So here I have old format panels for vanilla yogurt that's sweetened, and for the same company's unsweetened yogurt. Plain, no flavor, no sugar added. So they're using the exact same yogurt base, it's just in one they're adding some sugar and some flavor. So in the unsweetened yogurt, there's 7 grams of sugar. That is the sugar that is naturally present in the milk that was used to make the yogurt. That doesn't have to be listed as added sugar. In this case, you can see there are 13 grams of sugar in the sweetened vanilla yogurt. So the new format for this yogurt panel would say added sugars 0, total sugars 7. For the vanilla yogurt, you have a couple of options. You can list the total sugars as 13 and that it includes 13 grams of added sugars. But then you see it shows up as 26% of the daily value for added sugar. Remember, for total sugar, there's no percent. Consumers are gonna see that number and go, oh my gosh, this is really unhealthy for me because it has 26% of my added sugar. And they're going to ignore everything else that might be beneficial. So, in this case, you could calculate the amount that is actually contributed from added sugar. That could be from your recipe, or it could be from just comparing the nutrition facts panel for the unsweetened yogurt that had 7 grams. So this one has 13 minus 7 in just the plain yogurt gives 6 grams of added sugar. So here you see that line, 6 grams of added sugar gives 12% of your daily value, which is going to be much more acceptable to the mom who's convinced that added sugars, not total sugars, are going to make her kids climb the walls. So be prepared for those issues that are going to come up, for people to misunderstand those numbers, and just be prepared to explain it in the context of your product. And then here is the most common mistake I have seen. Here's the old one for chocolate ice cream. Here's the new one for chocolate ice cream. They've got 2/3 of a cup instead of half of a cup. They've used the correct values for sodium, for total carbohydrate. They have their total sugars listed properly. But what does this say? 3 servings per container. You have to have it listed in the dual declaration format. And as I mentioned, this is the most common problem that I have seen on labels that people have sent in for me to look at. So just be aware of those issues and make sure if you're switching to the new format, you're avoiding these. There's my email address. I'll pass out cards, but as long as my voice holds out, I'm happy to answer questions.
Going back to the vanilla yogurt example, what would be